Welcome to Women Don't Do That, where we empower you with inspiration, knowledge, and skills to redefine your boundaries and unleash your potential. I'm Stephanie Minton, founder and CEO of Beacon North Strategies and your guide. Small town girl turned CEO while navigating career, motherhood, ADHD, and chronic migraines. Our conversations range from interviews with visionary women to solo episodes filled with actionable insights. We are your hub for turning what ifs into let's go. Are you ready to redefine your possible? Let's get started. This may just be the most controversial episode of the Women Don't Do That podcast yet. So let's get into it. Today, we're going to be talking about embracing discomfort and why stepping out of your echo chamber matters. We're going to talk about this professionally, but also personally. This has something to do with our everyday relationships. I want to start by playing clips of some of what's going on in the US with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Let's take a listen.
Why is half the country supporting him? Why is he beating you in a lot of swing states? Why, if he's as bad as you say, that half of this country is now supporting this person who could be the 47th president of the United States?
I don't have any friends that are on the left anymore. And that wasn't because of my choice. It was because of theirs.
Wow.
Please just give me a valid reason as to why they're voting for Kamala Harris.
A valid reason would be that she hasn't been held legally responsible for abuse, defamation, fraud. She doesn't have 34 felonies.
So part of why I wanted to play those clips for you is to talk about how we are so polarized right now, which is part of why I wanted to have this conversation. There is so many different things that I'm seeing on social media, that I'm seeing in politics, I'm seeing in Canada, I'm seeing in the US, I am Canadian, and it just has me really thinking about this topic and my opinions on it and what I want to share with all of you, which brings us to today's episode. And so we're going to be talking about echo chambers, misinformation, and discomfort with differing views. And these can contribute to divides in our relationships. It's not just about politics, as I mentioned earlier, it's about personal relationships and everyday interactions. I want to talk about how embracing discomfort and exposing oneself to diverse perspectives are critical for personal growth, resilience, and building understanding. I'm not saying, however, that that is always easy, which is why we're having this conversation today. Why do I think it's so important? Why is it so important to me personally? I'm a big picture thinker. I care deeply about the state of the world and how avoiding discomfort can harm society and personal relationships. I care about big issues. When I listen to the House of Commons talk about housing, I care about that. Immigration, I care about that. Infrastructure, I care about that. Taxes, I care about that. Education, I care about that. I have opinions on these things, and I care about these issues, and I care about the impacts and the outcomes on Canadians and everyday citizens, and globally. What I see happening in the world hurts. And so let's talk about this. And we can learn so much when we work to relate to those who disagree with us. And it's essential for functioning society and for meaningful connections to step out of our comfort zones. I thought it would be fun to start with some definitions of some of these concepts, and we are going to dive into some more examples later and some really fun ones that I don't think you're going to want to miss. So the first one is misinformation. We've all heard this one. Misinformation is defined as false or inaccurate information that's spread regardless of the intent to deceive. We see this a lot through social media. We're going to talk about some examples later. We also see things like an echo chamber effect, and that's environments where we only encounter information that reinforces our own beliefs. And this leads to polarization and isolates people from opposing perspectives. And I guess you can guess, because we're not talking about it, it's not good. And we're also going to talk about confirmation bias, which is similar. Confirmation bias is about seeking out information that confirms existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. We're going to turn to an example, and we're going to talk about a CTV example. And first, what we're going to talk about is to recognize the context that we're operating in. Newsrooms, especially in Canada, have had so many cats that it reduces the editorial oversights. And there's very limited resources to do investigative reporting or proper reporting. In the past, there were experts on finance, experts on health, experts on all these different areas and niche areas where reporters could become experts in areas and do excellent work. And we see less and less of that happening and less well researched information. This is, of course, maybe not the only reason that this happened at CTV, but I do think it contributes to it. So, we are going to talk about the CTV news clip regarding Pierre Poilievre. You probably have seen me talk about this on our TikTok if it's something that you follow on my TikTok, which we can include in the show notes. You can find us there. But CTV had a clip of Pierre Poilievre. He is the opposition leader in Canada, and it led to mistakes. Or some people would maybe say it wasn't even a mistake, but it led to the fueling of misinformation because the clip was done in a way that it made Pierre Poilievre sound like he said something that he didn't, because a chunk of his sentence was actually removed. And in the end, CTV actually had to go back and apologize to Pierre Poilievre, and those staff who did that edit were fired. And so it was a really controversial time in Canadian politics, and it's not helpful because in Canada right now, we have a lot of concern around media putting out biased information. We can argue about whether that's true or not, but certainly that example put fuel on the fire of that actually being a concern in Canadian politics. There was lots of debate about whether or not the people should be fired, how far an apology should go. The reality is, with the dynamics in Canada right now, that the Conservatives are up very high in the polls. And so there is a chance that Pierre Poilievre could be prime minister and in the future, and actually a very strong chance. And so there was also this discussion about, is CTV just kind of bowing to the whim of the Conservative Party and Pierre Poilievre because he could be the future government of the day. We won't get into some of the other political discussions and policy decisions related to newspapers in Canada right now, but you'll get a bit of a picture about what the issue was about and how it caused issues and how it spread misinformation. Of course, there can be bias that exists in journalism in Canada, but it's often exaggerated. I know from myself personally working with Canadian journalists and knowing the system really well because of the type of work that I do in government relations, that so many of them are good people with strong integrity. And I will tell you, one thing I always get a kick out of is a lot of these journalists or different commentators that I watch on or listen to in different mediums in the news are often criticized by both sides. So one day, a liberal will be like, oh, you're so conservative, you're terrible, blah, blah, blah. You're in the pockets of Pierre Poilievre. And then it could be like 2 hours later, and somebody's like after them for being in love with the prime minister, with Justin Trudeau, and criticizing them. And so it's always entertaining for me when you can really see these biases, when people can take these people and sometimes even a similar situation and look at it differently depending on what party they like. It's very telling about what is going on. But these divides around information, disinformation, or being uncomfortable with other people's views are not just about politics, and they are also about personal relationships. And I personally hold a lot of relationships with people where I don't agree on everything that they think or even some of the core things that they think, but I am still able, without being in complete agreement with them, to have strong, positive, loving relationships with people. When we when we pull back all of the terrible things about humanity and some of the sad things in life, so many you want basic things, right? You want safety, love, and food. We are all just people. And I feel like we just can't seem to have those tolerance and personal relationships anymore. And I really do think that it is hurting us. And I want to talk about that discomfort. And, you may have to have that with your in-laws, sometimes your spouse, your classmates, your colleagues. Differing views are inevitable. It is something we have to learn to live with and put up with, and quite frankly, sometimes makes for better decisions and better debates about topics. For instance, maybe you're the type of person who is pro vaccine and you believe that there is a lot of misinformation on this topic, and yet you can still maintain relationships with people who disagree. You've taken the time maybe to understand their perspective, you can have empathy, even without having the same views on certain topics. You can acknowledge, of course, that there are times where you need to set boundaries, where relationships are toxic or unhealthy. But I think that line is pretty far away. Um, I personally find there's lots of good things about finding things to agree on and to focus on what you do agree on, and where those benefits are, especially in things where, sure, if most of your core beliefs are different than your best friend or your partner, maybe they're not the best person for you. But when you have colleagues who believe different things or in-laws who maybe believe different things, you still need to be in relationship with those people. Not that you have to be. And so maybe you can move through some of those difficult things. I recognize that that's not always the case. I do want to say that, but I think that that should be few and far between. And I just think that it's important to remember that even when I look at, I think a lot about politics, of course. So I want this podcast to be about politics, but also about personal relationships. And when I look at the House of Commons, for instance, right, and especially when you watch Question Period, because so much of Question Period now is about getting that special clip for social media, right? Where you can make sure all your followers saw you make this special funny quip in the House of Commons. However, one thing that's really, really interesting is that uh, a lot of political parties, they agree on the issue. What they don't agree with is how to solve it. It's the approaches that are different. But if you strip back some of the drama or the ideology, a lot of them care about the environment. A lot of them care about things like child abuse. A lot of them care about things like what's going on with drugs, right? Or However, a lot of them have different positions on the solutions about how these things should be addressed. And I think that is something to keep in mind. I also think when we look at politics and we look at that conflict that's happening, and especially when I look into the US from an external person, one thing that I think uh, maybe sets apart our two political systems is that so much of your system is around those two political parties. Where in Canada, yes, a lot of our system still revolves around conservatives and liberals, but we do have multiple choices in Canada. And even in the House of Commons, there are multiple political parties and there's four major ones. And so there is some diversity within our system and there is some movement between voters for different political parties. And I think that makes for a better political system personally. And I'm always shocked by what I see in the States with this binary choice and the impacts it has on citizens because it's like the haves and have nots. And of course, we have some of that in Canada, but I think we have less. And I think it's important to have less. I wish that you had less for our American listeners that live there as well. The other thing that I think is probably quite a controversial opinion, but something that I believe really strongly is that if you are a person who considers themselves as really smart and you focus your ideas and decisions on evidence base, then everything that you think and believe can't and shouldn't sit within one political party. Because when we look at the different political parties, and I can, especially can describe this from the Canadian perspective, politics gets involved, ideology gets involved. Let's say you're a conservative who believes in small government and market solutions. Not every policy decision that the conservatives puts forward actually matches those policies in that type of ideology. And so, therefore, they are sometimes making decisions based on polling, based on what's popular. That's not based on your core ideology. And actually, maybe the NDP is putting a policy forward that actually happens to align better with your beliefs. So, of course, most of your thoughts and beliefs and core beliefs or policy ideas might sit mostly with one political party, but there actually should be once in a while where a policy position might sit in another party. And if it doesn't, you might need to ask yourself some questions about what are your core beliefs. And for me, I think if you're smart and you're evidence based and you care about research and actual data, that again, although most of your opinions might sit within one political party, that there are some nuances there. And I think that is really interesting to think about. One kind of example related to that is the carbon tax. When we look at a carbon tax in Canada right now, it's very unpopular, especially with conservatives. However, it's been interesting that the Liberals have really endorsed this because it's a market based solution to climate change. Whether it actually impacts climate change, we're not going to get into that discussion and analyzing that information. You can look that up after. However, in the past, it actually was supported by conservatives because it was a market based solution. So, very interesting to think about some of the nuances there. I want to give you an example about some of these issues. So, one thing in particular, and this is talking about the political ideology, right? And the partisanship that can happen in politics. We look at an example related to housing, right? So if you're listening to the narratives around the conservatives and the liberals right now, housing is a big deal in Canada. And when we look at Pierre Poilievre, he's been criticizing housing costs under Trudeau. In the past, under a different government, Pierre Poilievre, our opposition leader, was the minister for housing, and housing costs were lower at that time. Then you will hear the liberals criticize Pierre Poilievre for when he was the housing minister because he didn't build enough low income housing, those types of issues, right? And it's interesting because both have valid points, both could be very true, but the picture that they're giving us as Canadians might be nuanced in their politics. And so you need to look beyond the partisan narratives to actually find out what is true. Maybe Pierre didn't build as much low income housing. Maybe the houses didn't cost as much because of inflation. Like there's all kinds of different scenarios. It also makes me kind of think of that saying right now that two things can also be true at once. But you can see how you can use information and points to back up your partisan views. And maybe there's some truth beside them too, but you need to then do the research to find that out. So, what I want to do today is to empower you as listeners to critically evaluate your thoughts, what you're believing, what you're supporting, and be open mind as much as possible. So much of what we see today is through the lens of social media. And when we talk about algorithms in social media, it is creating an echo chamber for you, it is reinforcing your own beliefs and biases. There's no question about that. The way that algorithms actually work on social media is that they use data on likes, shares, and comments to show content users, to show you as a content user what you are most likely to engage with. And then it keeps users interested and keeps them on the apps longer. And you see less and less exposure to diverse perspectives and reinforce your existing views on topics. And so it's really interesting. And one good test of this is to look at someone else's TikTok feed. Um, when I look at my husband's TikTok feed compared to mine, they are completely different. It's like we're not even on the same app. If that is not an example of algorithms and echo chamber effects, I'm not sure what is. I personally, especially partially because of the work that I do, for instance, I follow people, especially on Twitter, because a lot of news journalists in Canada share on there. It's a space where people in my industry spend time on X. I listen to people on the far left, on the far right, and everywhere in between. And I think it's really important, not only so I know what's happening in different kind of political camps and political views, but it's important to understand what other people are hearing and where they're coming from. You do have to be careful, of course. Across that spectrum, there's going to be some misinformation probably. And so you need to be smart about that. But I think opening yourself up to just not your narrow views is also a really important and smart thing to do. So, Why does this matter on the podcast? I actually think there is so much about Women Don't Do That that is really about sharing women's stories from women, different backgrounds, right? Women Don't Do That really started about, that woman who is the farmer or that woman who is the race car driver. And yet, all of these women could have different opinions politically, different careers, different experiences, different beliefs. And yet, there was so much we could learn from them from diverse perspectives and from people that have different lives from us. And I'm so passionate about it. And I also have found like there's just so much that we can learn from other guests, even if you don't agree with every single word that someone says. And I think that's really important. It actually makes me really sad sometimes because there are many times that I consider certain US guests, especially people in politics, that I think, oh, they would be fascinating to have on. And I'm not American. I don't vote. I don't I pay broad perspective to the politics there, but I am so deep in Canadian politics that I'm not deep into it like some people. Although to be honest, I'm such a political geek that I probably am in it more so than the everyday person. However, I would be afraid of backlash of having certain political folks on my podcast from the US. And I think that's really sad. You will find in Canada, I have had and will continue to have, and you'll see some in the next couple weeks, people on my podcast from different political backgrounds. And I think that's really important. And no, it's not just one party. If you go back and look, I have had people from different political parties and different backgrounds. I will continue to, and it's really important to me. And I would encourage you to listen to all of the interviews from Women Don't Do That. I think there's so much you can learn from them. I want to turn to talk about the interview from Alex Cooper with Kamala Harris, because this is kind of an example of what I was talking about, what happens in the US. And so, if you're not on TikTok or some of these social media things, you might have missed some of this story. But Alex Cooper is a TikToker. She has one of the most famous podcasts in the world called Call Her Daddy. And Kamala Harris was on her show, on her podcast show. She got a lot of backlash for that, for seeming to be partisan in having her on the podcast. However, she did extend an invitation for Donald Trump to be on her podcast as well, and she also shared that. However, if your feed, and I know someone who this happened to them, their feed is not as, let's say, Kamala Harris friendly, they never even heard that Donald Trump was also given the same opportunity. On top of that, there are lots of other podcasts that Donald Trump has been on that Kamala Harris maybe wasn't or maybe wasn't invited. And so it's really interesting to see Alex getting so much negative feedback on this. You might have different reasons why. Maybe there's other reasons why you liked it or didn't like it or thought it was bad timing or whatever. But if you pull it back to the broad perspective, she was getting hammered for offering both of them to come on and actually spending time interviewing one of them. And I just think it was such a double standard that she was being criticized this way when we see that Donald Trump is also doing the same thing. But again, just that perspective of like, I would be afraid to have a Democrat or Republican on because of this. And I just feel like that's so sad in some ways. I think for Women Don't Do That, and for us, for you as listeners, that difference of perspective is so important. And maybe I will someday get up the guts to have an American politician on the podcast. Yeah, feel free to send me messages about that as I think about that, or who might be interesting. Because I think that these differences of opinion and perspectives foster understanding and challenge assumptions. It helps us step outside of our own echo chambers and we just learn and grow so much. I think that's so important. Of course, you need to be careful about misinformation, but we need to embrace more being uncomfortable. We need to be more comfortable with being uncomfortable in our lives and that it's okay to be that way and to raise our kids that it's okay to be that way. We need to be engaged. We need to look beyond party lines, challenge bias, understand complex information, be smart. And I really want you to consider that for yourself. Are you in an echo chamber? Do you need to diversify your thoughts? Is it okay to engage with people that don't just think or look or act like you? And that's my call to action. Maybe you try to change your social media algorithm so you're looking at different perspectives. Maybe if you're listening to things regarding science, you're making sure you're really looking at actual evidence based research. Um, Take some time to reflect on what you're doing and how you can do better and what that means for your personal relationships. I hope that we can all reflect on that, be better people, be more comfortable being uncomfortable, value what we can learn from other people. You don't have to be their best friend, but we should be able to be in a room together and still be able to be in relationships. So I hope that gives you some food for thought. Of course, you can reach me on Instagram in my DMs if you want to talk further or share your thoughts. If you are interested in politics in particular, there is a Women Don't Do That TikTok where we, share podcast stuff and stuff about women. But there's also a Stephanie Mitchen Wen where we dive more into Canadian politics and issues related to that. So if you are interested in that, feel free to check that out too. We will include all of that in the show notes. Have a great week. Thanks for joining us on Women Don't Do That. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating or review. Connect with us on Instagram at Women Don't Do That and visit our website www.womendon'tdothat.com for more details. Join our Patreon to support our work. Find all of the links in the show notes. Remember, you have the power to transform your what ifs into let's go. Together, let's redefine your possible. Until next time. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Women Don't Do That, Stephanie Mitton, or affiliated brands.